Welcome back. This is Mr. Albertson. These are the early colonial notes. I understand that these would be more fun with pictures. We will do that very soon on the future ones. These are ones that are older, and I don't have the pictures put in yet. We'll keep working on things. So we'll start off with the first English settlement. Well, it isn't really Jamestown, is it? The first one is Roanoke, Virginia, but it only lasts for part of 1 year and everybody dies and we don't really know where they went. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on Roanoke. Jamestown, Virginia is the first settlement, English settlement in the Americas that really holds up. And it's a corporate venture, meaning that they came intending to earn money. They only brought men. They only brought people who were coming to do trades, like, in many cases, jewelers and goldsmiths and silversmiths. They didn't bring any farmers. They seemed to think that they could buy food from the natives, and not have to grow their own or find their own. They just thought they'd spend their time making gold and jewelry and stuff. So because they're not really prepared, only 38 of them survive out of the 120 after 9 months. Very harsh conditions, new diseases they'd never seen before, and really it's cold, and they don't have enough food. John Smith takes over. He's a kind of a gentleman of fortune. He's a mercenary. He takes over and imposes very harsh discipline, but he gets them through the winter, at least many of them alive. Virginia, the most important point that I want to mention is that they very quickly start to grow tobacco. Now, they didn't invent tobacco. Tobacco was well known. It had been grown in Mexico. It was known in the Caribbean. It was known in England. But there weren't a lot of good places to grow it. And they discovered that it grew remarkably well in Virginia. Tobacco just loves Virginia. So they started to grow lots of tobacco, which meant that they started growing things mainly for money. And they were even less interested in growing their own food, which meant they wanted to buy their food from the Indians even more. And the Indians were less and less interested in this because more and more white people were coming and wanting to buy more and more food. And it was pressuring the Indians to convert their lifestyle into one of farming to try to keep up with these demands for food. One of the things that the settlers do is they realize that they need more labor, more people to work these farms, and so in a critical move, they buy 20 African slaves from a Dutch trading ship which comes by in 1619. It's very possible that they had bought slaves before this, but we just don't know that. This was the first time that we can document that the English colonies purchased slaves. So in here we see the first two key ideas about Virginia. One, they're growing tobacco. Second, they're buying slaves and putting them to work, in this case, growing tobacco, more tobacco. And the third is kind of a secondary one, but it's also important, and that is that Virginia is really focused on a kind of democratic idea, but it's a democratic idea for rich white guys. It was not a democratic idea for everyone, only for wealthy white men. Wealthy white men like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, for example. Virginia is very traditional in other respects. They belong to the normal Church of England. There's not anything weird there. What's important is that they had been mostly bringing in what are known as indentured servants. Let me just write that here. They had been using indentured servants. Indentured servants were poor white people from England who signed a contract to come over to the colonies and work for as much as 6 years. It kind of depended, 6, 7 years. It depended on how much money that they owed. But they would work for 3, 6, 7 years on a farm to pay off the debt to be brought over from England. And during that time, they were treated almost the same as a slave, maybe slightly better, but not much better. Quite harsh conditions. And early on, many of these many of these indentured servants did not survive the harsh conditions. So very few of them made it to their 7-year period. But if they did, they were given a small amount of money, a mule, and a new set of clothes, and they were expected to go find their own farm and become a new citizen of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia. But many of these servants don't wish to become farmers once they leave their 7 years of service. More and more of them start to survive their term as conditions improve, and they just start living out in the forest, and they become kind of a problem for the wealthy landowners because these guys are out living in the forest. They're shooting wild boar, wild pigs that live in the forest. They're living out in the forest. They're free. Nobody's controlling them. And this is leading to other servants who work for the wealthy landowners wondering, why are they working so hard? Why don't they just go live in the forest with these former servants? Why don't they go live in this free forest zone where nobody's telling them what to do? And this bothers the established rich people quite a bit. And so we end up even getting a rebellion of these servants, and it's called Bacon's Rebellion. And it's easy to remember because a lot of the fighting was about whether or not they were allowed to stay out in the forest and eat wild pig. So, and you should think about bacon there. At any rate, the rebellion of these white servants leads to it's one of the things that leads to slavery, black slavery, because it became much more convenient in a variety of respects. Black slaves you didn't have to let go free at the end of 7 years. Black slaves you didn't have to pay them, and if they ran away, everybody knew they were an escaped slave. If your servant ran away, your white servant ran away and said, hey, I'm not a servant, I'm just some guy, how would they know? They didn't have fingerprinting, they didn't have photographs. It was hard to prove that an escaped servant should be off somewhere being a servant. But an escaped black slave could not blend in and therefore could be recaptured and put back into slavery quite easily. So that's the story of Virginia. Tobacco, slaves, to some extent democracy, but really tobacco and slaves, and a shift to really heavy focus on black slaves. Let me just slide the document up a little bit. Whoop, sorry, wrong way. All right, the next colony we're going to talk about is the Plymouth colony. The Plymouth colony is a famous one. Most people know about it. It was Massachusetts, 1620. This is the Mayflower Pilgrims. The Mayflower Pilgrims were trying to leave England for religious reasons. They felt that they could not live in England and go to the same churches as everybody else. So interestingly, they are supposed to go to Virginia. That's where they're allowed to go. But they claim that a storm blows them off course. Some people think that they went off course on purpose. But at any rate, they end up landing far away from Virginia. And so they have to come up with their own charter for how their community is going to work because they're not in an English colony. They're off on their own. So they come up with the Mayflower Compact. It's an agreement that they all sign. And what's important is this is the first time in America that people decide to govern themselves. They're not particularly, they don't have a parliament, they don't have a governor. They're just saying we're going to vote on stuff ourselves. We're going to govern ourselves. They have the same problems as other colonies, a high death rate, but lots of people come, the colony grows quickly, and as new towns are formed, this is super important right here, the new towns are allowed to govern themselves. They really tried not to control things from like a governor's mansion. They really tried to let each town make their own decisions. And this Massachusetts tradition is going to show up again and again in American history. So a tradition of self-government town by town. And they also had this in terms of their religion, that each church would govern itself. Next, the Plymouth colony is soon joined by a corporate venture, which are also by religious people, non-separating Puritans, just meaning that they were a little bit less radical. But they set up a company to start trying to make money out of Massachusetts. Just on that, let's talk about the religion a little bit. This is what's driving these people to come over. Puritans felt that God had chosen whether or not a person was going to heaven or not. This is what we mean by predestination. You're going to heaven or not is entirely decided by God, not by you, and it was decided by God before you were ever born. So your job in life is not to be a good person or a bad person. Your job is to figure out whether you're a good person or a bad person. Which is very different than a modern view. They also felt that God had made a covenant with good people, and that if they were good, he would take care of them, and if they were bad, he would punish them. So natural disasters were God's punishment, for example, and so were Indian attacks. The Indians would attack when God was angry with the Puritans, in their view. And they also felt that people were basically born sinful, which meant that the Indians were fundamentally sinful, as were children. Children, Indians, and slaves, people that had not been converted, were all fundamentally sinful and therefore kind of evil. Just a couple more details. We're not actually going to talk about the Puritan Revolution. It's very interesting. If you want to look at it in the history of England, it's fascinating. But conflict in England leaves lots of Puritans to move to Massachusetts. There's really a war over the Puritans in England. And we're just going to jump down here. You don't have to write all this, it's all here. But the Puritans kick out anybody who disagrees with them. So just jump down here to this part right here. Some people that the Puritans kick out: Mary Hutcheson, she organizes women into meetings. That's distressing. Roger Williams, he was studying Indian languages. He was against slavery. Those were very distressing things, so they had to kick him out as well. These guys move to Rhode Island and start a new colony. And Rhode Island becomes a haven for people who disagree with the Puritan view. So it gets a lot of kind of misfits of various types. Again, we're going to skip over this English history for a minute. And there's, of course, the famous Puritan encounter of the Salem witch trials, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. There's various explanations. It's something that'd be fun to read about. You can find lots of answers on the internet. You can ask me about it at some point. But that's it for this recording. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you later.